Welcome to this special session of I3 Return to Cairo. This is a webinar that's all about one of the most downloaded papers by embryologists. This is a landmark paper from an international expert group that met in 2017 to establish a consensus on recommended technical and operational requirements for air quality and lab design within ART labs. More than 50 consensus points were established under general headings such as assessing site suitability, basic design criteria for new construction, and of course, air quality. So we are going to have a fresh look today at what is practiced around the world and speak to key players in tonight's webinar, which is sponsored by Life Air. So we'll dispense with the long bios. All the contact information and the bios, which are very impressive, can all be found on the website www.ivfmeeting.com. But right now, I'd love to introduce two of my co-moderators, Dr. Chihan Halajakal and Chelsea Leisinger. So Chelsea is a lab director at Ovation Fertility and also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Veterinary Clinical Sciences at LSU School of Medicine, Veterinary Medicine, where she assists in the education of graduate students and the operation of an ART lab for domestic animals. Hi, Chelsea. Nice to see you.
Hi,
and Chihan, after working as an embryologist and lab director in Istanbul, Turkey for 15 years in very busy clinics, he moved to the US in 2015. And he's been the lab director at Yale Fertility Center and a faculty member in the department there since 2019. So in his career, he's built or refurbished 16 labs, which he enjoys very much, and air quality has always been one of his major concerns and focuses while building his labs. On to you, Chihan.
Thank you very much, Jindal, for the introduction. You are too kind. In return, I would like to introduce Sangita Jindal and Manar Hosyan. Sangita Jindal directs 2 IVF labs and is building a third that benefit from the great air technology. Dr. Jindal serves on SRM Practice Committee, and she was the co-president of the Society for Reproductive Biology and Technology in 2011. And she is currently the president-elect for the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, or SART. On the other side, Manar is an up-and-coming young embryologist, not a stranger to I3. She is an ESHRE certified senior clinical embryologist working in Ghanin Fertility Center in Egypt, and one of the most leading IVF centers in the Middle East. So, Chelsea.
Thank you. Finally, we're joined by expert panelists on lab design, construction, and air quality, Kevin Bomboy and Dr. Lars Johansson. Kevin Bomboy is an engineering manager and manages projects for clients that utilize clean rooms, high-tech laboratories, and pharmaceutical production. He's vice president with STV Incorporated and has specialized in high-tech projects for 35 years. Dr. Lars Johansson has over 30 years of experience in human-assisted reproductive technology. He has developed and designed labs all over the world and still travels to troubleshoot when called upon, and is an international scientific advisor for Life Air System, our sponsors this afternoon. But without further ado, our first speaker, a name synonymous with lab air quality, a man that first brought from anecdotal to academic studies the notion of VOCs and contaminants in the lab, impacting IVF success, Dr. Jacques Cohen. Read his extensive and extraordinary bio on the website. And I encourage you to please ask your questions using the Q&A section of the conference service and not the chat function. So take it away, Jacques.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Katie Werlo and team for the invitation. I'm very much appreciated. The Cairo Consensus was held in 2017, and the publication is from 2018. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened before that. Here are my disclosures. Since about 2012, I'm not associated anymore with companies that are interested in the environment and environmental contamination. But here are my disclosures anyhow. So the content of this presentation quickly is about early findings and definitions from the 1990s, the Cairo Consensus Meeting on the in vitro environment from 2017. Then extra some things to watch when planning a new laboratory or renovating an existing laboratory. Then I'll dwell a little bit about evidence, but others will come back on evidence later on. So it will be just a short introduction to that. And then finally, the conclusions. So early findings and definitions, VOCs. What are VOCs? VOCs stands for volatile organic compounds. These are organic compounds which have significant vapor pressure and which can affect the environment and can affect the well-being of humans as well as gametes and embryos. There are both natural origins of VOCs as well as those that are human-derived or because of interventions by humans. They are very complex in chemical interaction, and it's a very broad field because there are thousands, tens of thousands of compounds that are qualified as VOCs. Leaves are major emitters. Plants are major emitters, not just the leaves, also the other parts of plants and trees. But leaves are particularly big emitters through their stomata on the underside of leaves usually, and that's where terpenes come from, such as resins and turpentine and steroids. And terpenes are a very large group of chemical compounds, one of the largest distinct groups of chemical compounds. So certainly it's not just human derived, but also is derived from nature. Fortunately, those nature derived VOCs have a very high partition coefficient. Dr. Warrilow will come back to that later. And so they don't dissolve very well in aqueous solutions. So they don't dissolve well in culture medium, but they could dissolve in oil. So the early concerns are because of a phenomenon that occurred in the 1970s, and that's called sick building syndrome. It was described as something that occurs when there's poor ventilation or no HVAC units or poorly installed units and poor construction materials. And it could cause all sorts of adverse effects in the people working or living in those conditions. So that's from the 1970s. And it was in the 1980s when the first IVF clinics were established in the early 80s. And there were a lot of stories going around about the effects of environmental disasters. So not necessarily subtle effects, but more effects that were clearly measurable in either a complete lack of fertilization or no normal embryo development, or periods, sometimes quite long periods, of absence of pregnancy. So this was very stressful for the early embryologists, and suspected incidences had involved paints and glues and repairs of roadways surrounding the embryology lab. And usually those incidents occurred because the spillage of these compounds occurred very close to the laboratory air inlet. But the first more scientific approach that waited another 10 years or so, and it was the first in the 1990s were the first IVF lab testing and countermeasures that were published. And the first lab testing occurred with gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, which are relatively expensive, but more importantly than that, I think, they're very kind of slow methods to get results quickly. And so these were used and we were one of the labs that published on this. These were used and yielded information that was very interesting. We looked at correlations with particularly pregnancy outcomes and developmental rates of embryos. And we also looked for incidents of toxic spills or other events. A group that I didn't place in the VOC group, but some authors in the literature do place aldehydes among VOCs. Aldehydes are organic compounds, and those are obtained because of oxidation of alcohols. And you can see here the common determinant is the aldehyde group, which is a carbon-hydrogen chain, a carbonyl group, and a hydrogen atom, and that carbonyl chain is common among all the aldehydes. The most common ones are actually listed here: formaldehyde and acetaldehyde. You'll find those in almost all environments, both outside and inside. The one that was first described as having been shown to have embryotoxicity, and that was shown in the human as well as in the mouse, after tarmac sealant was applied outside the lab's air intake in the northeastern United States. And that was published by Jerry Hall in 1998 with the team of Antonia Gilligan. And we were also involved placing filter systems in that lab to turn things around. And that quickly, there was a tremendous inhibition of pregnancy, but it quickly turned around. And it's particularly because of the management of that team and their willingness to publish this, that changes were made. And finally, this particular topic got some attention. So this is acrolein. So the local and environmental contributions to the IVF atmosphere can be compartmentalized. Obviously, everybody thinks that outside is the biggest polluter. In actual fact, most of the VOCs and aldehydes can be found inside buildings, inside medical buildings, and inside IVF labs, and even inside machinery such as incubators or in medical gases. If we look at the ratio of that, the outside is usually 2 to 5 times cleaner than the inside per VOC, and sometimes it's 10 times cleaner. So it's important to get outside air ventilating through laboratories and IVF clinics. So the gas was considered a concern for many years, but these newer findings that the outside was important, and that the building could have very high levels of VOCs, and also the IVF lab, and also the air and the incubator. All that together was published at the end of the 1990s. And so laboratory design slowly changed to accommodate for these findings. And one of the early proposals was, well, not all these laboratories have HEPA filtration. They should have HEPA filtration. And yes, they should have HEPA filtration, but aldehydes and VOCs in this diagram here, if these are the pores in a HEPA filter, and this represents an aldehyde 10 times its size, this yellow dot, you can imagine that that absolutely has no effect on VOC transmission and aldehyde pollution. So HEPA filtration, great, but you do need either mechanical or chemical filtration before the HEPA filtration. So if we go forward, and different papers were published over the years that have been reviewed, particularly by Dean Moorback in an analysis of looking for evidence of this particular field, and also later by Estevez and Murillo in a book that was published, I think, around 2017. And some evidence has been obtained, usually in serial studies. And I think others will, in this format, will come back to that later. So there were more than 50 consensus points established in this meeting in Cairo in February 2017, and there were less than 20 participants. Most of them were experts in this particular area of the field. So here are some of these consensus points. VOCs, the total VOC concentration that's now recommended according to the Cairo consensus is less than 500 microgram per cubic meter. For aldehydes is less than 5 microgram per cubic meter. Do we know that that's the right cutoff point? Do we have evidence of that? We do have quite a bit, but it's not in absolute terms. So evidence still is aggregated, and hopefully more studies will be done in the near future and the future. The air changes per hour, we recommended 15 changes per hour, overpressure of 35 PA, and of course watching for overpressure between the different rooms. The temperature, the humidity, which we described as optimal between 40 and 45%, all depending on location, staff, contamination, culture system, and of course important, the potential effects of high humidity as well as low humidity on instruments and people. So, you know, there are tables in this consensus paper, such as these, which list a lot of the VOCs. As I said before, there are tens of thousands, but these are the most common ones that are found in laboratories. These were the older style laboratories on the left here that were measured by one lab, the lab of Antonia Gilligan in New Jersey, a group called Alpha Environmental, and the modern art laboratories that were purposely designed to reduce VOCs and aldehydes. And there were significant diminishments of total amount of compounds that were found. And you can see that here in the old style labs, it was about 4 times higher than in the new style labs. And often, not always, but often this was associated with improvements of outcome. So things to watch when designing a new lab or renovating an existing lab were also discussed in this meeting. Assisted reproductive technology laboratories have different requirements than standard surgical units. There are different VOCs and aldehyde sensitivities. And the sensitivities are usually on a parts per billion level rather than a parts per million level. The air intake should be isolated and pre-filtered. There should probably be 2 separate HVAC systems, one for the procedure rooms and laboratories, and then one for everything else. It's important to keep the HVAC on 24 hours a day and to have a backup generator for the first HVAC system that is controlling the sensitive area. There should be a backup battery as well, and probably UPS systems for different pieces of equipment. Also things to watch are listed here, such as sealing, material sensitivity, and oversight during construction. To use activated carbon, often in combination with potassium manganate as an oxidizing agent, or the live air system for filtration included in the HVAC system. So to go away from the standard that was before that, which was pre-filtration and then filtration to remove important contaminants, such as microbial organisms through HEPA filtration. The placement of the filter must be before HEPA, but downstream of the HVAC equipment. And we wanted the longest residence time as possible, so the recommendation was between 0.2 and 0.35 seconds. Residence time is how long VOCs are in that HVAC duct system where the filtration takes place. So in the VOC removal system, such as activated carbon and permanganate, you want the residence time to be as long as possible. The HVC submarine mode is something that has been proposed, that if there's an incident outside, such as that tarmacking incident in the 1990s in Maryland that occurred, you want complete isolation of outside air. And that can be achieved by being aware during the construction and planning for the construction. The supply vent should be close to the ceiling and the return vent close to the floor. There are other things as well that not necessarily came up in this consensus meeting. There have been publications, mostly in books, that you can find on how to construct an IVF laboratory with a lot of guidance, such as solid seating, airtight light fixtures, sealing the ducts, looking at all the penetrations in walls, doors fitting and sweeps, pass-through, watching all the materials, furniture, walls, countertops, ceilings, windows, and cabinets for particular VOCs and aldehydes. Don't use manufactured wood products. Avoid plumbing above the laboratory and the surgical suite if you can. And then burn-in guidelines, which vary between locations. Now, ongoing concerns and considerations after you're done constructing or after you're done renovating are servicing the HVAC system and filter changes. Those can be expensive, particularly when you look at the activated carbon. So you need to sort of be able to measure when to do that. No aldehyde-based cold sterilizers are recommended. Some infection control, certain infection control can be embryotoxic, so we should watch out for that. Plastic wear of off-gassing and preparation was discussed. Avoid packaging materials in the laboratory, avoid cleaning agents and cosmetic products. Cosmetic products often contain aldehydes. Avoid third-hand smoke. VOCs from scrubs, humans, clothing, equipment, and use VOC-free or nearly free detergents. Now, can we measure, rather than doing mass spec and gas chromatography, can we measure VOCs in the lab? Well, the problem is that the sensitivity really is on the parts per million level and not in the parts per million level. And all these handhelds are really nice, I think. I haven't seen tests being performed to compare these models for IVF laboratories. They're nice, but they're measured usually in the parts per million. An example is this one here from the Grey Wolf company. This is a more expensive unit, and that unit measures in parts per billion. So a little bit about evidence. An increasing number of studies of varying quality has been published. Many studies have been poorly designed because of different reasons for that. There was ethics involved, because how can you really do a study? You have to have two parallel labs, probably far away inside one building or in two buildings next to each other. Then you would have different staffing. The economy would be incredible. So usually these studies have been serial. In other words, a lab has been used with clear outcomes, and then that lab is left behind, and a new lab is established according to standards that some of those that I have described here. And improved air quality is achieved, and it's showing that there is improved air quality, and that may or may not show itself in improvements in IVF outcomes. A significant decrease of VOC and aldehyde concentration is feasible when you do all this. But you know, a few more or a few very good prospective trials will be beneficial for things like inline filters, or going from having regular medical gases going to nitrogen, for instance, that comes from liquid nitrogen, so that you get an ultra pure nitrogen gas in your system. Doing a prospective trial, to me, seems very doable. It's possible that filtration is essential for achieving optimal KPI, but more proof is needed. There are other potential consequences that may be longer lasting, such as genetic expression changes, but though that's just postulated, we have no proof of that. So the conclusions are that the in vitro system needs detox help. In vivo, humans are able to remove waste products from the environment. They have skin, they have perfusion through blood, they have lungs, they have liver and kidneys, and so they have that system in place that at a concentration even of parts per million, they're able to remove most of those, but not necessarily all of those volatile organic compound molecules. In vitro, it's embryologist dependent. The embryologist is in charge of the welfare of the embryo. Depends on laboratory design, mechanical and chemical filtration, oil sinks, water and media sinks, chelators, and antioxidants. Thanks again for this invitation. I'd like to particularly thank Antonia Gilligan, who is really single-handedly responsible for 90% of these suggestions and chemical findings. And of course, the consensus group in 2017. The meeting was organized by Mohammed Fawzi in Cairo, and Sharon Mortimer wrote the paper. She was the main author. David Mortimer was the first author and the main drive putting the program together. I also like to thank the folks at Alpha Environmental and Tim Schimmel, as well as Mina Alikani, for this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacques. That was fantastic. And I'm really pleased that you acknowledged Antonia, such a leader early on. She's still, all of her data is still so valuable to us. And that's how we started on this path, I think. And I worked with her early as well. She's terrific. And did you update the Cairo consensus in 2020 as well? Am I correct on saying that? There was another document?
No, the consensus has not been updated. Going over that paper in the last few days, I think it's still pretty much solid. I think the suggestions made still stand today. It's only been 4 or 5 years, right? So
Correct. Yeah.
this field hasn't gone very fast. There's so much open-ended question. There's so many open-ended elements to this. Certainly, I hope that people will take this on seriously and study it in more detail, maybe with animal models.
Excellent. There is a question from one of the viewers. I will just ask you this one question before we move on. Do manufacturers off-gas their products, for example, incubators, before selling them to clinics? I don't know if you know the answer, but this is
I give it a try. Well, it's a very good question, and thank you for asking this. I think some IVF-specific instruments have been made with the purpose of having components that are very low in VOC production. But this is certainly not the case across the board. And I know examples of where it's very good, and I know other examples where it's very poor. Obviously, that's information I don't like to share, but it's a very good point. On the safe side, I would make sure that particularly if you get new incubators, that you spend considerable time, as long as you can, considerable time in off-gassing. Some manufacturers offer off-gassing. Yes, that's a point. They offer that at a cost. And if you do off-gas, maybe not inside the laboratory if it's a large instrument, maybe in another space or a totally different location.
Thank you very much. Okay, that was terrific. So we're going to go on to our first of 2 videos. So here's a very short video from 2 of the original authors on the paper, Drs. Dean Moorbeck and Jason Swain.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to see everyone again virtually and be here and to talk about air quality, something that I've taken a keen interest in over more than a few decades now, and really from the start of Jacques' studies in the mid-90s. I did write a review paper prior to the consensus meeting in Egypt regarding air quality, and just my purpose to focus on was to say that VOC filtration is so critical, and it's something that was rather ignored up till then, other than, as I say, Jacques' work and others as well. We do, care about HEPA filtration and particulates, but really VOCs are what we don't have the ability to screen for easily, and therefore we need good air quality and good air handling systems to minimize that impact. There's several components to building the lab. That's all on the paper. You guys have seen all of that, but I can't help but appreciate how that's been part of our evolution as a field to get better and better at making embryos better and having higher success rates. It's really something that, it was incredible to take part in, and I think has been a great contribution to our field as well.
I think air quality is important for the IVF laboratory, especially after events such as a new lab build or a commissioning of a new laboratory, to make sure that you've obtained the air quality that you desire. Now, in terms of the ultimate importance of that, is probably an area of debate, and you'll hear differing opinions. I think there's not a clear cause and effect in terms of certain aspects of air quality and embryology outcomes. But I think most people would agree that moving into a new lab, you want to make sure that you've got very stable, appropriate conditions, certainly the conditions that you're striving for, and air quality falls into that bucket. And in terms of monitoring air quality, we certainly like to measure this once we move into a new space, especially. The nice thing is there are commercially available systems to help give you the air quality that you're after in the laboratory. But I think verifying that you're getting those numbers or that measurement of air quality is important. So upon move-in, we really measure that daily, and then we back down that schedule to weekly or monthly. And the nice thing is there are now commercially available devices that allow you to measure this at the appropriate levels, down to the parts per billion with various handheld measuring devices. Importantly, although we do let that measurement back down to a weekly or monthly level, we do have the ability to then measure as needed if we think there may be a change in the air quality that could be impacting outcomes. And where we are very meticulous about monitoring is with the change of our HVAC filtration, changing those filters and things that are responsible for giving us that air quality that we're after. And in terms of the impact of VOCs and air quality, I think this is an area of debate, and I think viewpoints and opinions differ around the world. Certainly it is an endpoint that we now have the ability to address through specialized air handling systems. That being said, the data that's out there isn't always entirely convincing. Most of it is retrospective in nature, or it's done through addition of VOCs and things directly into the culture media. And so whether that really would be reflected in the real world with the levels that you might have in a laboratory, in a modern incubator with some level of filtration, whether those VOCs can get down through the oil into the media at levels that could impact embryo development in the context of culture media, I think is unknown. And I don't know that we really could design or would want to design that experiment to purposely damage human embryos, but certainly animal models might give us the opportunity to do that and examine more real world settings to determine what the levels of VOCs or air quality may be, and to really prove to ourselves how far we have to go in addressing air quality as a factor in our laboratories.
I'm very pleased to be here for a second time, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Warrilow. She is scientist, founder, and CEO of Life Air. Please, you can see her extensive bio through I3 website. Dr. Catherine.
Thank you, Manar, and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And although an embryologist at heart, I am the founder and CEO of Life Air Systems, so wanted to disclose that. But I'm really honored to be invited to talk with you about a topic about which I'm fascinated and passionate, primarily because of the tremendous impact that it can have on, the successful cellular and clinical metrics within IVF. Specifically, as Jacques referred to, the VOCs, our viable and our non-viable particulates, and their impact on cellular and clinical outcomes. I wanted to begin by thanking all of those involved in the Cairo consensus, key opinion leaders, experts, global leaders, including Jacques Cohen, who gave an outstanding presentation a few minutes ago. It's really an honor to have him join us. Antonia Gilligan, I reiterate Sangita's comments. She's been instrumental in setting the tone for such a critical area of study. And but really it was their pioneering work and paper that really set the foundation, and we continue to learn from that. As many of you, as a lab director for decades, an embryologist, we're all driven to try to remove or control variables. As Jason Swain shared, there are countless variables that are going to impact our cellular and clinical outcomes. And so we all strive to try to remove and control as many as we can. One that was particularly elusive to us in our laboratory was that of the ambient air quality. And in the year 2000, we were asked to design and build a new IVF laboratory. And assuming that air quality was a variable that could be impactful to our process, we obviously didn't know then what we know now. We wanted to check the box. We wanted to remove it as a negative influence. And so we built and designed an ISO 5 or class 100 clean room from the ground up, thinking that if we culture our embryos in this space, that we will remove that variable. We followed all the leading suggestions, publications, again, some by Jacques Cohen, Antonia, Jerry Hall, Tim Schimmel, others, some leading recommendations from the biopharma industry. We had a dedicated air handler, sealed plenum, 30 air changes per hour, which turned out to be a little bit too high for IVF applications. We ended up adjusting that down. We had about 450 pounds of molecular media split between carbon and potassium permanganate. That's an enormous amount of VOC remediation media. We employed ALPA filters, that's just a step above HEPA, continually bathed in UVC light. We had airflow over critical points of process, followed clean room SOPs. I can tell you those suits are not comfortable to wear and are quite warm. And we were certified quarterly. But the gem of this lab, although we didn't realize it for about 8 to 10 years, the gem of this lab was the live monitoring that was done. The live monitoring really was only being conducted so that we could be certified as an operational clean room. But it's the data from the live monitoring of VOCs, viables and non-viables, that really taught us what airborne metrics were truly critical to the culture environment, to culture the human embryo. So how effective was the space? Were we successful in removing this one singular variable? The answer, after 10 years of studies, yes, but not consistently. And it's really the drops in some of our clinical outcomes, and then later the association of these drops with a breach of integrity of our HVAC system, the entry of parts per billion VOCs, and very low-level viable particulates or bacteria, viruses, and fungi that actually countered the success that we had been having. So it was really this negative data that helped us to learn more and define what level of VOC is truly necessary, what level viables and non-viables. It also led to an ongoing research that we're conducting to this day, looking at what VOCs are common to IVF laboratories, what are some of their concentrations, how do they travel, what are their kinetics of travel, say from the gaseous, the air environment in your laboratory, through the oil overlay, if that's being used, into the culture media, and then into the cell or the embryo. And once there, what are the mechanisms of cytotoxicity? So this work is fascinating, and we're continuing this to this day. As Jacques mentioned, there are 3 basic categories of air contamination that are critical to IVF: your VOCs, your viables, and your non-viables. Your non-viables are probably the least impactful to the human embryo, but necessary to control, because although they're non-infectious, they can serve as vehicles, if you will, for the infectious viable particulates that therefore attach and remain airborne. Most IVF laboratories, no matter where your location, have 4 common pathways in which the air contaminants can enter your laboratory and impact the culture environment. Your outside air, the recirculated air within the laboratory, the fabric, as we call it, of the laboratory space, the construction materials, and then the air provided by the HVAC system itself, the ductwork, which is often not paid attention to. So beginning with external sources, as hard as we tried, we could not control the activities of our neighbors. Common activities such as construction, moving soil, construction cutting through board and wood, finishing a cement foundation, airing demolition, asphalt, fresh asphalt. This probably impacted us in 4 different cycles, and where they resurfaced a medevac pad on the opposite side of the hospital campus where our laboratory was, we had parts per billion of toluene, which is highly embryotoxic, enter our laboratory, and that was one of the causes of a compromised cellular and clinical outcomes. But fresh asphalt, whether it be resurfacing a medevac pad or resurfacing a road, repairing a rooftop adjacent to you, again, very common outside activities that are outside of the control of the IVF laboratory. Our laboratory was based at a level 1 trauma center. So we had 8 medevac helicopters, idling ambulance engines. Again, these were not near our air intake, but still were contributing to some of the VOCs and viables that entered our space. General traffic exhaust, restaurant cafeteria VOCs generated from that, whether it be within your hospital or a neighboring restaurant down the street. Generators. whether this be the generator belonging to the IVF lab or the hospital, these typically exercise on a weekly basis. So on a weekly basis, you're going to have a continual release of embryotoxic VOCs. Relative to within the laboratory, Jacques referred to this, and he's correct. I mean, there can be a number of very significant sources of VOCs within the IVF space itself, many of which are very difficult to avoid. I'm sure all of you on this webinar have opened up a sterile sleeve of tissue culture ware and smelled the styrenes and toluenes. That's obviously parts per million. If you're able to smell that, thus the reason for the off-gassing. Disinfection SOPs, your equipment's going to off-gas. Even new gasketing that you may use to repair your equipment can continue to off-gas for months, if not years. Your refrigerators, your freezers, as they're going through their compression process to maintain temperature, can release VOCs. Medical gases. We ordered at that time, the highest quality medical gas called research grade. It was the most expensive, but still had a large number of VOCs concentrated, especially as you would continue to use the tank. And then we shed, the embryologist, the clinical team, patients. This is actually a publication not on embryologists, but actually on an OR tech in scrubs, hats, booties, mask, similar to what embryologists wear. And they actually documented the significant shedding or production of VOCs, as well as biologicals and non-viables. In discussing the fabric of the laboratory as sources for VOCs, every detail matters. The ceiling materials, the walls, the paint, the higher the tint, the higher the color in the paint, the higher the VOC levels, potentially off-gassing. Flooring, adhesives, caulking, sealants. Again, I mean, we could have an entire webinar just specific to this topic. It's all critically important. And then finally, the air provided by the HVAC system itself, or the ductwork that's providing the air into your laboratory. In IVF, we create the perfect environment for growth, perfect temperature, perfect humidity. So therefore, a lot of your airborne pathogens, allergens, and toxins are also going to continue to proliferate. I want to show you, unfortunately, we see this far too often. This is an image taken by my colleague, Eric Marsh, downstream of a medical grade HEPA filter. And just about 1 foot from where you can see this ductwork is going to have the air enter an IVF laboratory. So we saw this, and if you notice that an effervescent green coating the ductwork, this is actually, after culture, Aspergillus. Now, Aspergillus can cause illness and infection in staph. It's also cytotoxic. Aspergillus itself is quite large and should be captured by the HEPA filter. But Aspergillus, like any other organic captured by the HEPA filter, has the ability to continue to grow. It needs 2 things, food and water. Food are often the other organics, sometimes the matrix of the filter. Water is simply the humidity in the air. So as these organics continue to grow, if they're able to produce spores, sometimes those spores are small enough to be allowed into past the HEPA filter, and therefore you saw the coating of the ductwork. As Jacques mentioned, VOCs are not captured by the HEPA filter. And just given our current status, hopefully coming out on the far side of this with the pandemic, SARS-CoV-2 is a very similar aerodiameter as the influenza virus. It's about 0.2 microns. Your HEPA filter is rated to capture particulates 0.3 microns or greater at a 99.999%. So a lot of your smaller viruses are not going to be 100% captured by the HEPA filtration. The reason it's so important to not only capture, but completely remediate and destroy fungi, mold, etc., is because if they're continuing to grow, they may be captured, but if they're continuing to grow above the space you're trying to protect, they are a very significant source, or they can be a significant source of fungal VOCs. This is just a short list listed here, many of these proven to be cytotoxic. But again, the reason that you want to strive towards versus a capture of the fungal or microbial VOCs, more of a destruction, so that they can no longer be a source of cytotoxic VOCs. In addition to fungal VOCs, those common to the IVF lab are polar, which would be your alcohols, your ketones, your acetones, your non-polars, your benzenes, toluenes, and styrenes, low molecular weight, high molecular weight hydrocarbons, microbial, and biogenic. Jacques referred to these. These are produced by trees, shrubs, leaves. These often impact those of us located in an area with 4 seasons or multiple seasons. And many of our colleagues see undulations in their clinical outcomes based upon the seasons. Again, parts per million, if you're able to smell something right now during this webinar, that's parts per million. Parts per billion is absolutely what we want to strive for. We are often asked, in fact, we ask the same question. We have carbon, we have potassium permanganate. We had 450 pounds, as I mentioned, in our HVAC system. Is this going to protect us from all VOCs? Unfortunately, and we learned the hard way, the answer is no. The reason being is that carbon is going to do a phenomenal job adsorbing your non-polars and your high molecular weight VOCs, but it's not going to be able to adsorb or remediate other biochemical families that are very common and in existence. Your potassium permanganate will do a great job at oxidizing some of the polar and low molecular weight VOCs, but it's not able biochemically to remediate all of the other biochemical families of VOCs. Everyone tries to strive to culture in a closed environment, if you will, under oil, using tabletop incubators, time-lapse imaging. Unfortunately, this is not going to completely deter VOCs from entering your culture media or impacting with the embryos that you're trying to culture. One of the reasons is that as much as we strive to maintain a closed phase environment of cell culture, many of the SOPs that we have to use, whether it be flask preparation or media preparation, preparing thawing agents, during cryopreservation, a lot of these, unfortunately, are still exposed to the ambient air. And we'll talk about some of our research, which shows frighteningly how quickly some of these VOCs can enter the oil overlay and then cross into the cell culture media, into the cellular layers. As Jacques mentioned, there are tens of thousands of VOCs, and I like to describe them as each having their own biochemical fingerprint. The action of every single VOC is dictated by a set of unique metrics, unique to the VOC: a partition coefficient, a level of hydrophobicity, and vapor pressure, such that entry into the oil overlay or the media is very unique to that VOC and can occur fairly rapidly. Some VOCs can also be biphasic, where they're existing within the oil, but also they have the ability to cross into the cell culture media. And once present in the media, they're a permanent threat to the gametes or embryos that you're attempting to culture. As an example, your alcohols, your acrylins, your formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, these are all hydrophilic and they're very water soluble. So rapidly entering the cell culture media or having the ability to do so. Versus your styrenes and benzenes, these are very hydrophobic. So they're highly oil soluble and have the ability to more easily cross into the plasma membrane of the embryo. All of this, as I said, led to extensive research on the mechanics, the mechanisms of travel of very common VOCs in IVF from the air phase across the oil overlay into the cell culture media and thus into the cell. Much of this is driven by laws of physics, and this alone could be yet another webinar topic. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And a lot of our recent work is being published in the next couple of months in RBMO, which we're very excited about. But when you think about, picture 100 parts per billion of IPA, isopropyl alcohol. It's really Henry's law of physics, which I won't go into now, but again, fascinating topic, as well as thermodynamic equilibrium that's going to help drive that IPA into the oil overlay and then eventually into the cell culture media. Once in the media, yet another law of physics comes into play, your octanol water partition coefficient, as well as cellular homeostasis. That's going to help drive that VOC again, depending upon the individual metrics of the VOC and the environmental conditions, can help drive those levels into the cellular state or within the embryo itself. And again, much of our most current work is being published in the next couple months, as well as we were honored to be invited to share some of that information in the new textbook coming out in 23, Clinical Embryology. A lot of our data comes from multiple sources, most of which are from IVF labs in North America. As Jacques mentioned, there are handheld units to do live VOC monitoring, PID testing. The two that we've used is the Gray Wolf model that's sensitive at parts per billion levels, as well as a Ray unit. Again, these have to be very carefully calibrated. They can become unstable, but they have to be very carefully calibrated and used with frequency. It seems as if the more often these are used, the more accurate they can be. Just examples of this, just placing these in any area, in the IVF lab, in the clinical procedure room, wherever you may have concerns, just letting that run 24/7, it's a phenomenal teaching tool. And then looking at at what time, during which days are we having spikes of total VOCs, and then correlate that with whatever activities were happening at that time. And that can help you actually teach, train, and adjust your own SOPs. But these are going to identify your total VOCs. The next step, if there's an interest to identify, all right, which VOCs are these, what species and what concentration? That's when you want to deploy the TO15 canisters and do some of that air testing to really identify, are these problem VOCs? And once you know which VOCs, you can typically identify the source and try to remove that source. Another tool that we've used is the molecular media, the analysis of the molecular media, or the used VOC filters. So you can determine with the proper lab SOPs, basically the effective life left at the end of your use of your filter. And this is interesting because it's specific to your location, your staff, your SOPs, your patients, any environmental events, and just gives you an idea of anticipated time to exhaustion of that filter, because obviously you want to be proactive in changing those out. Some of the assays will also identify which biochemical families have challenged that particular filter. And then that can help you identify those particular sources of VOCs, and again, take actions of remediation. Just one table from some of the work that we've been doing, looking at some of the most common VOCs that we have identified across numerous IVF laboratories, again, primarily in North America. But in looking at, this is just a short list of those that we found most common and the most common concentrations. If we take, say, isopropyl alcohol or IPA, the average concentration was around 157.3 micrograms per cubic meter. When you model that using the algorithms that we just discussed, that actually equates to 520.1 micrograms per liter within the cell culture media. And then that equates to 15.6 micrograms per kilogram within the cellular base itself, or within the embryo. And all of this occurs specific to IPA, from the gaseous mixture to the cell culture mixture media to the embryo itself in 90.7 minutes. And again, this is VOC specific. So we've done this, run these algorithms on the most common list of VOCs that have been identified across carbon and potassium permanganate protected IVF laboratories. Once within the embryo, there are a number of leading publications that have identified the impact of particular VOCs on the mammalian cell, whether it be perturbing the cellular membrane, causing an increase of intracellular calcium, impairing mitochondrial function, et cetera. And I'm happy to share any of these, as well as the impact on cell metrics and cell delivery to the patient. So in summary, we've learned through decades of work, and again, none of this would have happened without the pioneering work of so many, including Jacques Cohen, Antonia, Tim Schimmel, Jerry Hall, I mean, just Dean Mortimer, countless, Morbeck, countless critical studies and publications that really started and helped guiding this field. But the air serving our culture environment is exceptionally dynamic, and it's influenced by outside source air, materials used in the lab, protocols, staff, your own HVAC system. And we've learned that very subtle levels of airborne VOCs and biologicals can be tremendously impactful to successful human embryogenesis and clinical outcomes. These embryotoxic VOCs existing in the gas phase can rapidly enter the cell culture media and embryo, therefore exerting some of their cytotoxic effects. So it's therefore critical to control the quality of the ambient air, control this one variable serving your in vitro culture environment to optimize the consistency of successful pre-implantation embryogenesis, and why we're all here to provide improved levels of patient care. So again, I'd like to thank all of those who led this through the Cairo consensus and all those performing research prior to the Cairo consensus. I'd like to thank our great team of engineers and scientists, our research laboratory and clinical colleagues, and each of you for your invitation to join you today. We really look forward to solid discussions.
Thank you, Catherine. Excellent, informative presentation. Real quick, many of us have older and established laboratories. How can we improve our air quality and culture environment in a laboratory that's been established?
That's a good question, Chelsea. And it's one that we're often asked. I would say I would start with just assessing what you have, assessing the air quality within the IVF laboratory using some of the techniques that Jacques and I mentioned. I would assess the air quality coming out of the final diffuser in your laboratory. Look at the components of, again, what you already have, the air handler, the humidity system, dehumidification systems. Is it still serving you? Is it delivering what you need? Is it maxed out? And those are, I would start with really an investigation of what you have in the environment that it's providing.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. So while people watching this webinar think of questions to ask our speakers and panelists on air quality and lab design, be sure to put those questions in the Q&A function and not the chat function. We're going to show a clip from a video montage of some of the most modern IVF labs in the world, and the entire video is available online at the I3 website. Enjoy.
So it's very important when considering a location for a lab, what the sort of the ambient air condition is around the facility. For example, are you going to be building your laboratory near a highway? Is there a rubber plant near your lab or your oil refinery? You know, unlikely. But you know, one can never control exactly what's around you. So my recommendation before someone builds a lab is to do an environmental check. You know, check the air around you just so that you know what you're dealing with as a sort of a baseline, and know what it's going to take to get your internal air quality to the level that you need.
Hi, I'm Dr. Chelsea Leisinger. I'm a lab director for Ovation Fertility, and I direct 3 labs, 2 in Central Louisiana and 1 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm currently in my Lafayette, Louisiana laboratory. Construction in this laboratory started in 2019 and was completed in 2020, and we did our first cycles in this laboratory in May of 2020, post-COVID, and we do approximately 200 to 250 fresh retrieval cycles a year.
Hi, my name is Anastasia Mania. I'm the lab manager at King's Fertility, London, UK. This is our lab behind me, which we built in 2018 and started working in 2019. We moved from an old site across the road from King's College Hospital. We do 1,800 fresh cycles and over 1,000 frozen cycles.
When I was looking at trying to put this lab together, I looked at, the literature, I looked at, my colleagues, I looked at my friends, and there really was one main system that seemed like it could do it all for us. We used a consultant to help us ensure that our research was accurate, but essentially ended up with the best state-of-the-art air handling system for IVF. And we still have that, and it still has performed flawlessly for us. And I say us, I've now retired about a month, but this lab is still going and doing great.
Hello, my name is Allison Bartolucci, and I'm the lab director at the Center for Advanced Reproductive Services, which is part of the University of Connecticut Health Center.
Hello, this is Next Fertility Nordic. We are from Estonia, located in Tallinn, central Tallinn. And my name is Karin Rosenstein. I'm a manager of the clinic, and
I'm Samantha Wake, an embryologist at the clinic.
And our clinic and lab was built in 2020, and we opened a brand new clinic in last summer, 2021. And we had a chance to build our clinic from the scratch.
So when we were constructing the lab in 2018, it was very important to make sure the air filtration system is one of the pioneering ones that will control for obviously particles, volatile compounds, and other compounds in the air that will affect the quality of the air and of course embryo quality as a result.
The facility is actually right off of a major highway, so optimizing the quality of the air in the IVF lab was one of, if not the top priority.
Our laboratory is situated in the center of London, so air is really important. We have buildings all around us being built as the hospital is expanding.
So in previous years, before we built our new laboratory, we would notice seasonal fluctuations. Being in central Louisiana, we are on the outskirts of town and close to the rural sugarcane fields. And every year after the sugarcane is harvested, the fields are burned. And there's extensive smoke in the air and very poor air quality that lasts for quite a long time.
You've all witnessed the tremendous, devastating wildfires that Northern California has experienced. And one of the major impacts of wildfires, secondary impacts besides the incendiary aspects of, burning your properties and belongings, is the smoke and all the stuff that comes off from burning materials. And unfortunately, we were inundated with ash and smoke a couple of times now over the last several years from regional fires that have blown the smoke into our area. And certainly that smell and those conditions can compromise embryo development. And I'm happy to say that in our clinic at Stanford, the only place that you could not smell the smoke was in the IVF lab.
So once we built our new lab and began using a powerful air system with the multiple stage filtration and maintaining it appropriately, we have not noticed any seasonal fluctuations due to the sugarcane fields. And once we opened the lab, we actually noticed a 10% blastocyst increase with our improved air filtration system.
We used a lot of the components that have since been published in the Cairo consensus, particularly where it pertains to the HVAC system. Again, we are right off a major highway, so that was a concern. It was a new building, there was new furniture, so we really wanted to optimize the IVF lab. We wanted to have a unit that was attached to our HVAC system that was specific for the IVF lab and the operating room, which was adjacent to it, that, you know, had a series of molecular media filters as well as UV filters that could really separate and target the lab that was the air that was circulating through the IVF lab.
We had a good advisor, IVF expert Lars Johansson was advising us. Yes, with Lars, we took basically Cairo consensus.
It puts all of the anecdotal commentaries and what we all knew together in a published document. And it would have been very helpful for me as we were designing this new lab to have, you know, documented publication of what was important and, you know, what was required for optimal IVF air quality. A very useful guide for not only lab directors and embryologists, but also for the folks designing new labs or renovating existing labs.
Which describes good quality IVF lab requirements, and we started with lab design, how it's located, all the materials are selected with good care, and we paid attention, of course, about our air quality, and there is special attention was paid on ventilation system, because we know that the air quality has a crucial role for IVF outcomes, and there was separate project for our ventilation system, and we decided to integrate in addition to regular HEPA filters, we integrated also VOC filters ordered from Lightfire, and we regularly, you know, measure VOCs and try to keep the VOCs down in low.
The design of the lab is so essential within the clinic. So the IVF lab is completely separated, but it is accessible to the OR procedure room via a door or window, and accessible to the andrology lab, which is kept separate also by window. Next to the lab, we have the cryo room, special for the liquid nitrogen tanks. And we also have a separate room for the gases, so the gas cylinders, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And the clinic is arranged so that the consult rooms are surrounding it, but each door has an extra lobby so that there's no direct flow from the external clinic into the lab, and it remains a positive pressure inside of the lab.
Every 6 months, we perform air quality checks. We evaluate with a VOC meter and a particle counter to see the quality of the air in the laboratory, and that is recorded in our maintenance manual. And with our new lab and our filtration system, our particle counts were virtually 0, and our VOCs were undetectable, and they remain that way since the opening of the lab.
So our monitoring system that obviously monitors temperature and CO2 in our incubator and surfaces also monitors 24/7 the VOCs in the room, because of our environment, the outside air being so polluted, being in the center of a big city. It is really important to have 24/7 monitoring, especially for VOC, which we monitor in parts per billion, which is the most accurate way of measuring.
When the filters are changed out at the prescribed interval. For our laboratory, it's every 9 months. The used filters are sent off for testing to make sure that we don't need to change our filters any earlier, and that we can sometimes change them later, and that, you know, can equate to cost savings. But they're evaluated every time they're changed, and then we get the report back.
There hasn't been an extremely high VOC reading because we have such a good filtration system. So sometimes, because it's so low, almost zero, in order to test as part of quality control, that apart from the servicing of it and replacing whatever needs replacing in the actual box for the VOC, we when on shutdown every Christmas, when we don't have embryos in the lab, we actually deliberately put some volatile compound smell temporarily to make sure that it actually records it. So this is part of our checks as an independent check to, apart from the maintenance of it, to make sure that things are working as they should. And generally speaking, as every embryologist does, we, you know, reduce the chemicals and the odors that we bring in as much as possible. We have scrubs and hats, and we change shoes, all these things that we obviously don't wear perfumes, all these things that we all know and do to make sure that VOCs are as low as possible.
Other measures that we utilize to keep our lab air quality clean, we have a monitoring system that tracks our air quality and alerts us if our VOCs are out of range, and that's recorded daily. And the laboratory technicians wear scrubs that are clean, and they change when they're on site, and they don't wear them home.
During the design, it was designed that IVF lab has the highest positive pressure, around 40-50 pascals, and all surrounding rooms have like 10 pascals lower, like operation and entrance room to IVF lab has lower. And Samantha can talk about regular quality measurements.
So we have good quality control procedure in the lab. So monthly we do extra checks, for example, with the VOC reader, and the small particle counts, and obviously other quality control measures in the lab, temperature, and we keep the humidity between 40 to 60% as well. And within the small particle counts, we do it at various stages throughout the room. So under the laminar flow hoods and in the middle of the room. And also we check the particle counts in the operating room and the andrology lab as well. And we also do lab shutdown every year. So we do a deep cleaning every 6 months, where we clean the incubators, and also we regularly check the microbiology swabs, so to check for bacterial growth on the lab surfaces and in the incubators. And all of the equipment is serviced and calibrated every 6 monthly, and we get the filters changed also every 3 months, depending on the equipment. So at the back of each incubator, we have a special filter, as well as the filter in the ventilation room, which is the HEPA and the VOC filters.
So we have many levels of quality control. We have daily checks of quality control, weekly checks of quality control, monthly checks, and quarterly and yearly. We do agar plates for air quality yearly in different areas in the lab. And then obviously we use a monitoring system that records daily to see trends, and we analyze the graphs quarterly, unless we get an alert earlier that we obviously need to act on when it's outside our normal levels. The Cairo consensus came out in June 2018, and it was exactly when we were actually choosing a filtration system. So it was a great guide for us to make sure that everything we designed so far was correct, and everything we are planning to do, especially for air quality, is actually according to the latest consensus. And Cairo consensus was extremely important and helpful for me to design this lab.
In addition, we We followed a lot of those rules or guidelines that pertain to furniture. So we knew that like any sort of particle board or anything that had a formaldehyde base was a big no-no. So most of our furniture is stainless steel or had a ingredient list that did not have any formaldehyde in it. We have sealed floors, sealed ceilings. I think you can see behind me. We do have positive pressure in the IVF lab, which is monitored with the, we call them the balls in the wall. So every time that somebody goes in and out, you can hear the balls popping, indicating that the pressure there's positive pressure in the IVF lab. Also, we follow what I think most labs do. We have a very strict fragrance-free policy throughout the whole facility, but especially in the IVF lab. We wear the scrubs are laundered by a company that the soaps and the detergents have been cleared for any sort of, embryo toxicity or shedding. And, we really our kind of motto is better to be too strict than to sort of let things get loosey-goosey and regret it in the long run. So we don't really cut any corners. I think, our motto in terms of managing the IVF lab on a day-to-day basis in terms of air quality is to keep as much stuff out of the lab as possible. So anything that can be done outside of the lab is like packaging, unpackaging. We off-gas all the plastics in laminar flow hoods. We don't have visitors, unless they are medical students that have been gone. We've given them the rundown in terms of fragrances and stuff like that. So we just try to keep it minimized, any new introductions into the lab. But we don't have any VOC monitors or anything, but I mean, we do have those filters checked and cleaned or replaced every 9 months. That Life Air filters and the HVAC filters are on a schedule as well. And they check the filters for what's in there too, just to see if anything changes. So if there's an uptick in formaldehydes or something else, then they'll recommend that we change them more frequently or look at our processes. We have had consultants, some of the experts in IVF lab air quality come in. We do it maybe every other year, quite honestly. They come in and they do a full rundown. So they do the sulfur test where they test the, to see if there's any leaks in the seals of the walls or the floors. They test for VOCs, they evaluate the HVE system, and then sort of give us a commissioning report after that. That's done, like I said, every other year almost. One of our biggest environmental contaminants is probably just pollution from car exhausts and things like that. We are part of New England, which is well known for the climate changes. So it's not really a pollutant, but it's a challenge is to keep up with the humidity and temperature changes, because even the most sophisticated HVAC systems struggle with keeping up with the vast changes in temperature and humidity. So I would say that is operationally one of our biggest challenges, is the dead of the winter, getting that humidity up to, the system really likes to operate at about 45% humidity, and it's very difficult in the middle of the winter. And then at the same time, in the summertime, it's the opposite problem, is trying to keep it lower. So I would say that those are the biggest challenges in this area.
IVF, especially IVF laboratory, is fraught with variables. Obviously, the biggest variable being the patients. But, aside from that, we have so many sort of plates spinning that we need to monitor and keep in the air, that if we can rule out the air quality impacting our outcomes, it's a huge reassurance, it's a huge safety net, and it's critically important, in my opinion, to have, so that you can not worry about that that variable.
Thank you. That was a wonderful clip of that terrific video, which entirety can be found on the website. But I think because of the incredible number of participants and questions that we have for our experts, we're going to shift now to the Q&A section, which is so fun. And Jihan, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Sangita. Well, I think it's the time for start a discussion between us about the excellent presentations and those beautiful videos that we actually watched. And it's actually, I would like to know, Sangita, for example, you are building a new lab at the moment. What are you comfortable with, for the off-gassing of your laboratory before starting the cycles? What time period would you give to a lab after building?
Well, first of all, I want to say I have severe lab envy after watching that video. Those labs were gorgeous. So I was not taking screenshots, but I will be going back to the video to look at them. So when I build the lab, which will be my third lab using Life Air, which I'm very excited about, there is a burnout phase. And I usually follow the good guidance of Katie and Eric and the people at Life Air, but it's at least, I think it's about a month. Is that right, Katie? That's usually what it takes. Am I remembering?
It can be 2.5 weeks, depending on what temperature you can hit.
That's right. So that would be the answer. Couple of weeks to a month.
Okay. Well, Chelsea, what's your opinion about the off-gassing of the laboratory?
I think it was very important and quite effective in the building of our lab and the success when we first opened our lab. We off-gassed ours for 2 months. And then it actually ended up being longer because COVID shut us down. But yeah, it was very important.
And for example, if you don't have enough time for the off-gassing, what kind of measures do you guys we can take in our laboratory to, kind of be more comfortable about these things? Sometimes it's a rush. It's not well planned. Lars?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't start. That's a no-no. I would burn out as much as I can. High temperature, high circulation. And for equipment, I usually demand that they should burn them off by the factory before they send them out. Because it takes such a long time to burn them out. When you come in there, you have to have a special room, as Chuck was talking about, to burn them off. And the slightest smell, we don't use it. It's usually the rubber in the incubators, but it could be anything actually. So we take one equipment at a time and introduce it, and then clean it up also when it comes in. So we demand that they burn them out. The biggest problem is actually something we haven't really talked about, is what do we know about the production of the medium? Is it performed in VOC-free environment? We have batch differences, you see, and we can't find the reason for it. And we can't find also, and even the companies can't find it. Is it because it's not produced in VOC-free environment? Because you can't see it, you just see the consequences.
Well, Manar, what is your experience in Egypt about building a new lab and the air quality?
Actually, I have no experience to build a new lab, but from hearing from my colleagues, there are many industries here or just office that will make the degassing before introduce the incubators or to introduce an instrument inside the lab. So they make the degassing or the off-gassing outside of the construction itself.
That's great, because it's one of the questions that I was planning to ask. Who is actually off-gassing the laboratory empty or putting the devices in and off-gassing? I think it's kind of very important to make that decision as well. Sangita, do you have any opinion about that?
Well, I was wondering if the experts have any advice on how long. I think we had 2.5 weeks, although Chelsea said 2 months, my goodness, and even longer. What temperature would you recommend the burn off to be at? And should the equipment be before or after? This is a question, and from one of the attendees.
Well,
I know.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
What we've recommended is, if possible, to off-gas the equipment outside the laboratory. As Lars said, order it as soon as you can. Preferably sometimes older equipment is better, but try to off-gas that outside the laboratory. And then as far as if you have equipment in the space, as long as it's not going to be harmed by the high temperatures, but we'd recommend upwards to high 80s, 90. Running at full tilt with your air changes. Obviously remove all of your filters but the HEPA in doing so, and just letting this run through for a minimum of 2.5 weeks if you can do that.
And also I saw a couple of laboratories who are constantly cleaning the walls and the paint during this period as well.
We do testing, or if you have any biologicals or anything. So we have a clean room expert coming and cleaning the walls, the floors, everything before we install the equipment. And then it takes a week to get the results. And then they tell us that it's fine, it looks okay. And then we start with cleaning in the pre-entry room, the burnout equipment that we have, and gradually introducing them. Because as Katie was saying, you can't increase the temperature too high for equipment, then you destroy them.
I see. And also I would like to ask, the inline gas filters. I think, we have different types of incubators, which we have big box incubators, which have a lot of volume and requires a lot of gas running through the filters. And we have the desktop incubators, benchtop incubators, which are kind of requires much less gas. So who would like to comment on the inline gas filters at this point?
Yeah, I can. I think that early on we had not much information about how effective they were. It's a filtration system that's not recirculating. It's one line, and you expect over a few millimeters, you expect a very high level of removal, and of course that's a big challenge. The newer filters that have been produced by different manufacturers were tested by Antonia about 7-8 years ago. And I challenged those results because they were unbelievable, very, very effective in removing aldehydes and VOCs. I really couldn't believe it, but she stood by her data. I don't think that's published. So that was different manufacturers, from different manufacturers. So I think those filters have become better over the years. The manufacturers probably have ways of internally testing it and not necessarily sharing that kind of data. But then, of course, the question is, how often do you change them? And of course, there's an expense related to this as well. I do think that the whole topic of the gases is incredibly important, right? The gametes and embryos are 98% of the time in incubators, and so their environment comes from the gases. And of course, there can be pollution inside these incubators from things like non-polymerized styrene that is highly volatile, but the gases are important. And so I was happy to see in one of the videos, maybe I misinterpreted, but it looked like they were actually using vapor oxygen and vapor nitrogen, which would make it ultra clean, because medical gases, and this was published by Tim Schimmel early on, medical gases, if you look at the gas cylinders, some of them are very clean and others are not. Antonia recommends that if you use gas cylinders, medical grade gas cylinders, that you don't empty those gas cylinders, that you go to about 15–20% and then you stop, because there is a partitioning of the volatile organic compounds in the gas cylinders. They do try to stick to liquid most of the time. And so all of the liquid will become more and more toxic the more the cylinder is being used. And so try to change it before it's empty. I think it's a very small recommendation, very simple recommendation. It's a bit more costly, but it will probably make a change. Some cylinders will be clean though. You can't just apply this to every cylinder. But going by Tim's findings early on, 1 and 3 cylinders is well, really highly toxic.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Doc. I think I'm going to switch gears and ask Kevin a technical question. Can you speak a little bit to the lab pressure, maybe what it should be set at and the importance of that?
Sure. Obviously, we're trying to keep those spaces ultra clean. So we typically pressurize it to at least 0.05 inches water gauge. I know there was values listed in metric there, but 0.05 to 0.1 across the door, across the lab. If you get much more than that, doors become hard to open, things of that nature. But when we're doing a lab, we'll typically shoot for those, and we'll monitor with a pressure gauge across the door or a physical device to make sure that the labs stay positive. But that's been our experience, everything from clean rooms to BSL-4 labs. So
I agree.
That answered your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what you say, because there have been, when you come to new built labs and they can't even open the doors, it's so hard for them because the overpressure is too high. You spot on.
Yeah, we struggled a little bit when we built my new lab. With,
Can I come back to the filter?
Just right.
I have one question. I want to know how often we usually reach out to measure the VOCs level inside the IVF lab.
Manar, can you ask that again?
Yeah, she broke up.
I want to know how often usually or should we measure the VOCs level inside the lab? How often we measure the VOCs level?
In my lab, it's measured daily and continuously with a VOC meter as part of our alarm system. But then we also get like a Tiger VOC meter that we share amongst the lab in innovation as needed, at least every 6 months. It can be up to every month.
Yeah, I think that's the best approach, is if you're able to just let it run 24/7 and coordinate those spikes with activities, just having an awareness 24/7.
I think it's a great question, Manar, because Katie knows in one of my labs, we had it running, and we use a gray wolf meter, which measures in parts per billion, and it was picking up something and we didn't know what it was. Number two, we had to get the machine recalibrated, but it was picking up stuff you would never imagine. I think it picked up a dust removal canister that was in a cupboard. That was off gassing, that had been there, and it was in the back and we didn't even know it was there. And then we had alcohol swabs in one of the drawers, which we never use. And if it had not been running, we wouldn't have known, and it spiked certain VOCs. And it was just fantastic to know that information. So if you can run it continuously, I think there's value there.
That's really interesting. What about the male semen collection andrology areas? Is this an overlooked area? I know we've been focusing a lot on the IVF lab itself. Does anyone have any thoughts about VOCs in that particular area?
Well, we never have the semen samples coming into the main lab. We have it through a hatch later on when they're prepared. So we don't process them in the embryo lab at all.
And I think, Chelsea, we look at this, one program at a time. It depends on whether or not the andrology lab is talking to the IVF lab relative to air. How separate is it? Is it only communicating through a pass-through? So we evaluate it individually. to optimize, both environments.
And also there is a question about some of the laboratories that I know of, they also cover the walls with PVC or corian, to make sure there's no painting. And what's your opinion, Katie, about this? Covering with, corian or PVC, the walls, not doing the painting. What kind of impact that can bring in terms of VOCs to the lab?
Well, I mean, those materials have been relatively approved, assuming they're low VOC or no VOC for furniture. As far as covering the walls, I mean, if you use basically a paint with no tint or no VOCs, you should be good, assuming it's wipeable. Are they trying to cover a tinted or colored paint? Was that the concern?
They are not covering it, they're just using the material to cover the walls, not putting any paint. It's just covering all the walls. It's an expensive way of isolating, but for example, I had a lab with corian before. It was expensive, but I never had that lab never repainted again. You can clean them, you can wash them. It's like extremely easy to clean that laboratory from scratch. Some laboratories in the world that I know of have such covering of the whole IVF laboratory. That's why I asked. That was the question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of the go-tos for lab furniture. So I would assume that would equate to the covering the walls if that's affordable.
Yeah. Katie, may I just jump in there a little bit? We see that more in clean rooms where you're trying to get your particle counts down to virtually nothing. But we do low VOC paints, scrubbable paints all the time in labs. So, it's an expensive solution. I don't know if it's, worth the cost or not. So.
I see.
Kevin, can you speak to the levels of VOC and particles that you're trying to achieve in an IVF lab clean room?
Well, I'll let Katie touch on that a little more. It all depends on what area of the lab and things of that nature. But Katie, you want to jump in a little bit on that as well or not?
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, Kevin has tremendous clean room experience. I know with an IVF, we try to hit, the metrics that we learned were so important for consistency. Yeah. So really,
under 5 is not uncommon for those kind of labs, for the in vitro labs. We've done labs that are down, or labs and clean rooms down to, ridiculously low counts, like class 10 clean rooms and stuff like that, but not at the IVF level. But I would think an ISO 5 would be more than adequate.
Yeah, I would say, delivering ISO 6 is more than adequate for IVF, less than 100 ppb total VOCs, less than one spore per cubic meter. Those are our goals.
Right.
There are usually also bioclad walls, and Korean I've seen also, but the glare from the white is terrible after a week in that lab. It's so whitish and it's terrible. But I think actually in Greece they have labs like that also. And I think Giles probably know more about that also. So it's also used for loft benches. So to keep it really clean, easy clean.
Yeah.
Moses from the audience says he has glass all around his room. Glass, my goodness.
I see that.
That's amazing. And glue, we have to mention glue. I remember Antonia going on about adhesives and sealants and the VOCs that come from that. That's part of it when you're talking about construction. So important.
Yeah, we always encourage using floors that are heat welded, no adhesives. And there is another question about flooring from Arafat. He mentions is epoxy VOC free? Is that a good choice for a lab floor? I know what we've seen more often are the Mipolam or Medentech floors. Kevin, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
We've seen those too. We've seen epoxy, and it's more of a cleanability where the floor and the coves and the walls all kind of match up and there's no seams and things like that. Again, those kind of materials, if you can get low VOCs, that's great, but usually there's a significant off-gassing on those type of floors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
There
the seamless part that you mentioned is key.
But you also have VOC-free now mats that you can say, and they are F-lot free as well. So, but they are very hard to put in. They are a little bit stiffer. So you can get those actually.
Dr. Mina Alikani wants to comment. We need to conduct experiments to show how VOCs in the air find their way into culture medium dishes inside the incubators. So far, we only have indirect evidence of negative effects, outcomes based, but no direct evidence. What's your comment? This is from Dr. Mina Alikani.
That work is actually ongoing as we speak, relative to specific VOCs, and then following the kinetics from the gas to the oil to the culture media to the cell, obviously not using human embryos.
Okay.
So are there specific VOCs that directly correlate with poor development? Do we know that, or just a subgroup of VOCs?
Though there are quite a few publications on specific VOCs relative to mammalian cells. There are, I mean, there are more mammalian cells in general, just in vitro culture, than anything else.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another question. According to Cairo consensus, the acceptable level of the VOCs inside the IVF lab is about 0.4 to 0.5 part per million. So that means, which means we still have them inside the lab. How we can reduce the effect of this very low concentration, which affect the outcome, especially the reproductive outcome and the embryonic development?
Did I understand it was about plastics? How you can get rid of the VOCs?
Yes, we have acceptable limit or acceptable level according to the Cairo consensus. But we still have low concentration inside the lab. So how we can reduce this effect to the minimum levels to overcome the harmful effects on the embryonic development?
Do you know which have the VOCs been identified? Because that'll help identify the source.
Actually, I mean in general, the VOCs in general. No specific, no special type.
So probably the fastest way to identify how to bring those down would be to identify which VOCs that they are, and then identify the sources and minimize those. That to me would be the fastest way to bring that number down. And that's easy to do with just canisters.
You can also measure in a box where you analyze what the plastics are sending out. And as I can recall, it was Jim and Sally Cat many years ago at Monash. They were doing some experiments of embryo tested dishes, and they were sky high in VOCs. So when I ask the manufacturers if they can measure the VOCs, they say they're not interested. The plastics are so good. That's the answer I get.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to start to wrap up. This has been just a terrific session. We'd like to thank all who took part in this webinar, my co-hosts and my panelists, Dr. Chihan, Halachikal, Manar Hussain, Chelsea Leisinger, Kevin Bomboy, and Lars Johansson, and our wonderful speakers, the king and queen of air quality, Dr. Jacques Cohen and Dr. Katie Warlow, and not forgetting our team from I3, thanks to the organizing committee of this initiative, I3, who are, again, Jacques Cohen, Peter Naj, Marianne Sveites, Thomas Elliott, Giles Palmer, and Fran Farley.
So thank you for joining us, and join us again with another webinar, Cryo Governance, Best Practice in Cryo Transport, and sponsored by Cryoport. I hope you have enjoyed our session. Remember that it's a podcast already on the i3 webinar, all about air quality and life air. And I'd like to extend the offer. If anyone wants to hear more about the lab design, just go into Life Air homepage or follow links from the i3 webinar. I've been in the business now for 34 years. I've traveled the world and I've set up a lot of clinics all over the world. And I do also confidential auditing of existing IF clinics, troubleshooting, and I improve techniques and outcomes. So you're welcome to contact me as well. I usually say you get blind on your home, in your home clinic. You don't see what others see when they come in there. And I experienced that myself, and it's not so fun sometimes, but I'd love to hear from you. So bye-bye from me, and au revoir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Stay safe, stay well.